this clip, we look at ISIS, or ISIL, the self-proclaimed Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Fateh Azam gives us some of the key background to understanding how this movement reformed out of different factions into its present-day constitution.
ISIS, or ISIL, is essentially an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, which is an offshoot of Saudi Wahhabist thinking. It is that interpretation of what does the caliphate mean, and whether or not we want to go back and recreate the caliphate as we imagined it from 1600 years ago or 1400 years ago, you know. And it's that kind of mindset that has its roots in Wahhabist thinking in Saudi Arabia that resulted in Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda, you know, 2001, you know, and before. The real beginnings were really in the jihadist war in Afghanistan that was supported by the US and by the Western powers. So that concept is still there, is the same exact concept as what ISIL has now. The only thing that's happened is exactly what happened to the Islamic Empire, if you will, back in the year 700 something, which is, you know, as soon as the excitement of, you know, spreading the word of God is done with, you start having struggles over money and power. And that's exactly what's happened. You know, ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and Al-Qaeda were all one group, essentially, you know, in the way that they are kind of disparately organized. I mean, you know, essentially tomorrow I can bring together a few people and call ourselves, you know, the Beirut affiliate of ISIL if we want. I mean, and they'll say, okay, great, yeah, come join. But it doesn't mean that we are an organization. So what I'm saying is that they had a fight in Syria. This is my understanding and my reading of it. When the Al-Qaeda in Iraq came in to help the Al-Qaeda in Syria. They fought with each other. Al-Zawahiri, who was Al-Qaeda, you know, base, said to them, okay, stop you guys, stop fighting. You guys go back to Iraq and you are ISIL, and Jabhat al-Nusra is our Al-Qaeda in Syria. And that's when Baghdadi said, no, I don't agree. We're going to start declaring the caliphate now. Why do we have to wait? It's not any different in terms of thinking. You know, the difference is that what the Arab revolts did is opened up an almost chaotic sense of, I have something to say too. And if many people traveling to Syria or to Iraq to fight with ISIL is an expression of, I have something to say too. Yes, I have given up, and because I think, you know, the Western notions of democracy have failed. The Arab collusion with that is, you know, has failed in providing for me as a citizen. And you see many stories of individuals in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere who are actually middle class. They're not necessarily poor, but ideologically they are impoverished. They are impoverished ideologically, and you present them with a very nice, clear, you know, God said 1, 2, 3, and of course I interpret what God said, you know, and come with us and we will change the face of this earth because we will create the caliphate anew. Here's a new vision. The other vision, the democratic vision, if you will, the secular vision, is much more complicated and much more nuanced and much more detailed, and it's very difficult to grab a hold of, you know, because every piece of it is supported by something or someone that you severely disagree with. I'm a human rights activist. I mean, this is my work, you know, as a Palestinian, as an Arab. I've been working in the human rights field for almost 30 years now. Okay? And one of my biggest problems is the assumption somehow that human rights came from the West. You know? So I get conflicted about proving every time that the idea of human rights is an international concept. It is a universal concept. It did not come from the West. It did not grow out of, you know, Western liberal democratic thinking. It grew out of a global experience of World War I and II. You know, and there's a lot that you can. So then you have to delve into a much more complex historical debate to convince people. It's much easier to say, oh, this came from the West, and, you know, the Quran came from God. What's the choice there? The choice is very simple.
It's important as well to understand the ideology of ISIS. John Turner explains this through a history of contemporary Islamic fundamentalism.
Well, ideologically, they're very similar to Al-Qaeda and other what you call Salafi jihadist organizations. And essentially they fuse these two ideas of Salafism and jihad. Salafism comes really from the 19th century, though it has a longer historical origin. It became prominent in the 19th century with Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who started to question really what had happened to the Islamic world, essentially. They were seeing a decline in several areas, particularly economics. There was increased levels of intrusion from Europe. And they started to ask, why had this happened? I mean, Islamic civilization had been so dominant in terms of culture, technology, medicine, astronomy, all of these areas of civilization. And it had fallen into decline. And Afghani suggested that really what the problem was is they needed to go back to the origins. So they needed to look at what they called the Salafs, so the righteous predecessors, the early people of really what was the first Islamic state, which was Muhammad's community in Medina. So he advocated looking back to this time and taking a fundamentalist reading of Islam, because what had happened, they argued, was over the last 13 or so centuries, because of through judicial matters within Islam itself, within the clerical class, there had been what was called abrogation. So there had been changes and rereadings of the text to interpret things to work in more contemporary times. Afghani argued that this was problematic. We need to go back to the beginning and start over again, in essence. Well, his followers took this in a very different direction, and they took this notion of going back to a fundamentalist kind of state and fused it with jihadism. So this idea that this must be done through a violent enterprise. Afghani himself didn't advocate any kind of violence. He thought that you could take what was good from Europe, what was good about modernization, and Islamicize it, essentially. The contemporaries take their cue from Sayyid Qutb, who was from the Muslim Brotherhood, and really fomented the modern idea of what jihadism and Salafism collectively would mean. And so that's how you get essentially what was Al-Qaeda and what was many disparate jihadist organizations around the world from the 1980s up until now. ISIS, as we know it, comes out of something called what was AQI, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And ISIS took advantage of essentially this deteriorating situation in Syria and in the Middle East and the revolutions in general. So their ideology, their objective is essentially establishing an Islamic state, ruling from a very strict fundamentalist reading of Sharia, and doesn't really have any constraints on the methods by which this is achieved.
Given the impact of ISIS, one of the concerns is if it can become a state. Noor Kuprulu suggests this is a difficult situation, a difficult question to answer, but it also needs to be contextualized in relation to notions of the state, authoritarianism, and legitimacy.
Because it's the first time that we can see a non-state actor in international politics, not only in the Middle East, is acting like a state. Mm-hmm. That's for sure. And if you read their, let's say, dava, their, in a way, declarations, you can definitely see that they want to create a state. And the territorial demarcation is already also mentioned. They have their, let's say, bureaucratic organs, they have their budget. Even I read in a newspaper yesterday that they spend more money in social services than to the armed forces. Mm-hmm. ISIS has become such a kind of an organization that it both, let's say, reflects the idea of death, but at the same time giving an idea of, let's say, new lives for most of the people in the region. Mm-hmm. But what I can tell is ISIS is still having a war in the region. Although they have certain protected places in Iraq and in Syria, like Raqqa. They're controlling several cities in Iraq and in Syria. But ISIS is, let's say, is also fighting with so many different groups. So it will be very clear, maybe in the near future, about when the future of Syria is going to be clear. Because ISIS is now also fighting with Free Syrian Army. Bashar al-Assad didn't want to directly involve in this conflict between ISIS and Syrian Army and all other opposition groups in Syria, because it was also in favor of Bashar al-Assad, because 2 or 3 rivalry groups, they are fighting with one another, and it is something favoring Bashar al-Assad rule. So nothing is clear at the moment, because when the future of Syria is going to be, I think, a little bit clear, then we will be also understanding the future of ISIS. But for the moment, they call themselves a state and they want to establish a caliphate. And as I just mentioned, the borders have been already, let's say, mentioned and decided. What I can tell is, while looking to ISIS, is this nation and state formation process in the Middle East, I think again and again requires to be analyzed. Because of the artificial borders that dates back to Sykes-Picot Agreement, San Remo Conference during the post-war settlement, nation and state building process in Middle East, because of the colonial rule, because of the artificial borders, because of the ruling elites that were, or notables that they were supported by the imperial colonial powers, there is such a kind of a structure established in this region that for 100 years there is a legitimacy problem. Mm-hmm. You can talk about the regimes, but we have to also talk about the people. I would like to always make a distinction between the regimes in the Middle East and the people, because what they think, what they prefer, is actually very much different from one another. And when you look to the Arab uprisings in 2011, mostly it was because of the internal reasons. As I just explained to you, because of this nation and state building and the anomaly that was created in this region, and the lack of national identity. Yes, there is a state, and sometimes the state is very strong. We call it like din wa dawla, din, religion and state has been always together. But in terms of creating legitimacy, popular support, these regimes needed to create authoritarian rules. And these authoritarian rules, after how many decades, we have been let's say we have seen in 2011 that still there is this legitimacy crisis. Mm-hmm. So given that there is such a kind of a situation that the states lack legitimacy and popular support, and there is a very weak loyalty to the state, these non-state actors sometimes can act more and more strongly than the states themselves.
Umut Kurduz goes one step further by suggesting the borders have changed.
To my view, borders has already changed in the Middle East. I mean, when you look at the borders, the de facto boundaries, we don't have anymore the boundaries which were drawn after, the Western colonialism. Mm-hmm. We don't have the boundaries which were established, so-called independent movements against the Western domination during this period. Mm-hmm. We don't have the boundaries of the so-called, again, socialist regimes, the Ba'athist regimes. We don't have the boundaries of kingdoms. We don't have the boundaries of the authoritarian regimes anymore. So ISIS provides an alternative to the understanding of statehood. Not, like a very, let's say, unknown alternative. It is already, it was already experimented by the Iranians, by the Iranian revolution. They tried to establish a state based on the religious values, or at least on discourse. Now we have a Sunni version of this. You know? And regarding the statehood of the countries, of those actually countries in the region, the question is with statehood, right? Can we speak of a statehood of Syria today? Can we speak of a statehood of Iraq today? Statehood of Egypt? Statehood of Libya, right? Yes, this is a big question mark. Which statehood or whose statehood, right? Was nation statehood? Was there a nation at all? I mean, from the very beginning. This is another question. The nation was simply constructed, right, by the leaders. The idea of nation was constructed, right? Now you see the Ummah as an alternative, right? The religious society, religious community, right, rather than the nation. So the nation or the community of religion rather than the community or society of nation. Whether it will be successful or not, we will see. But whether it has certain boundaries, yes, it has certain de facto boundaries. I mean, there are certain places under control of ISIS, right? And there's the control over these boundaries. There's also the services, the social and economic services provided by the ISIS structures, right? Like taxing system, you have the taxing system, you have a local economy under control of ISIS.
In Lebanon, isn't it?
Yes,
Like they are
yes.
also
So it is already like a pseudo state, right? I mean, it is, yes,
yeah.
it's like state-like structure what we have. And it's on the way of institutionalization, actually, creating certain institutions which will provide the future Islamic Sunni state. Again, whether it will be successful, it's a big question mark. I mean, in the Middle East, you never know, actually.
Finally, given the precariousness of statehood and borders, ISIS is having an effect on states in the region. John Turner explains this as a threat to stability and security.
Well, certainly it threatens their security, as is obvious, and not just Iraq and Syria. It's a threat to Turkey. It's certainly a threat to Jordan, and increasingly, it's serving to. I think one outcome that would be particularly problematic is destabilizing Lebanon, which already has significant issues with its own legitimacy, with what it considers itself as a state as well. As far as, for example, it really changing that border between Iraq and Syria, I don't think that it will, and the reason that is because I don't think ISIS has long-term potential. Because it lacks that legitimacy amongst its own population, it's entirely dependent on its force and its ability to gain financial resources through the sale of oil. Eventually, I think this is the kind of, it will eventually be pushed back. It's not going to go away. It's going to start to look more and more like Taliban resistance did in Afghanistan. They'll get pressed to the perimeters. It'll be very difficult to uproot them from Raqqa in Syria. But I think what you're going to see is that for the conceivable future, that the recognitions of the Syrian and Iraqi border will remain. I don't think it's dramatically going to change. Whoever comes to be in control of Syria in the end, I tend to think that the regime will probably eventually manage to take the country back. And so this kind of infighting, there'll essentially just be ungovernable space for a long period of time, like you see again in Pakistan, for example. You have ungovernable space. But that border between Pakistan and Afghanistan doesn't change. No realization of that changes. But of course, borders are porous the world round. And I think what this does in terms of, of questions about international relations is it does pose questions as what constitutes states in the first place and what state borders really mean. Because for the moment, yes, ISIS has erased this border for practical purposes. But will that be a long-term relationship? Probably not.